So, first, I'm very pleased to be there. To be honest, the last time I came here was probably 25 years ago for a football game, tournoi triangulaire, I think we call still that. And so that's the only reminder I have of Polytechnic. I don't know if we won the game at the time or not, I don't even remember that. I'm going to speak to you very fast about Air Liquide because that's not the purpose, and then more specifically about energy transition, because I guess that's the topic of some of your studies on the classes, and then focus on what could or what should be the role of hydrogen in that energy transition goal. So Air Liquide is a rather old company. We've been created more than 100 years ago, 110 years. 15.2 billion sales. We're present in many countries. And each time we go in a country, we invest in production, distribution, on a lot of facilities. So it's not trading, it's a really locally based company. 50,000 employees, many customers. We serve all industries, which gives us a very good knowledge of what's happening in the world, in industry. And also we serve a lot of patients in healthcare. This is our way in the B2C world, business to consumer, is the healthcare industry. This is to get you to become a shareholder of the company before becoming eventually an employee. It's not only to show that, it's also because it's very, it's because we have that I can be there today to speak with you about hydrogen. It's because we have delivered sustainable growth every year for 40 years that we have a shareholder base which is rather unique, with 40% of our shareholder base which are individuals, that they trust us and they give us the time to indeed invest and take the time and effort to promote things that are going to come long term. It's absolutely critical in the governance model of industry nowadays, having a shareholder base with a lot of individual people who want to long-term returns and not short-term bubbling or bustling kind of a financial market approach. In that world, if you have that shareholder base, you can develop long-term investment and long-term strategies, and that's why we can do that on hydrogen. We have three trends which drive, which we believe are going to drive the future for our growth and for our key strategic decisions. The first one is the evolution of fossil and global energy resources and the scarcity of resources, and also the issues related with greenhouse gases reduction. Second, and it's connected, the world population continuing to grow on two converging trends. First, the shift to urban areas, which raises a lot of issues in terms of environment, in terms of mobility, clean mobility, but also in terms of clean air and being capable to live in very dense cities in a comfortable way is a big issue. Second, aging population, which raises a lot of other issues and opportunities for us, but that's not the topic of today. Third, innovation. And I guess you see that probably better than me in your studies, but we've passed, a couple of years ago, we've probably passed a time where technology is more advanced than our dreams. And that's rather new, because in the past we used to have a couple of dreams and technology was there to help us solve them. Now I think the technology capabilities in many ways are beyond what we were imagining in many fields, and so it's possible with the technology to change things probably more radically than what it was in the past. So we believe that technology and innovation are going to be key driver for the growth of the future and for the solution of many issues we have in the future. So in order to capture that, we have a very specific organization. I'm not going to be long on that. Basically, the laser is working. Yeah. So we have created something which is there to try to push and open new markets which are going to be significant long term, but which are today very small and very disruptive, but which are also very advanced and very focused markets like the space industry, the aeronautics industry, or everything linked to supraconductivity or things like that. And within that, you've got many initiatives around hydrogen. And we have also an equity fund, because we believe we cannot invent everything ourselves. We need some time to go and invest into partnerships or startups And so we've decided to have a small fund to invest into startups. So we have also our science and technology usual suspect, R&D, engineering, and technology application centers. And we have created also an open innovation lab, which is prospective thinking, which is rather disruptive also within Air Liquide, and which is supposed to help us figure out what could be the world of tomorrow and help shape it in a way which we believe is better. I'm not going to spend too much time on that. These are the key subjects we are working on within the advanced business and technology world. So you see, we start with things that we know today. We have the technologies to supply rockets, to supply planes with inerting systems, to supply tracking technologies for cylinders, and to support large scientific projects with helium solutions. We are working on the CERN, we are working on the ITER project. Those technologies will enable us to move into new fields which are beyond the traditional uses and even transforming. And when we speak about hydrogen mobility, of course, it's disruptive because today there's no real market in hydrogen, but we believe long term it will be a significant one. So what I want to tackle with you is how can we make hydrogen part of the famous energy transition? First, I would like to go very fast with you with facts, because I think if we don't share the facts, we cannot move further. Then we have a belief, and we feel there are a couple of elements to substantiate that belief, and then we have some challenges. So the facts first. I'm not going to be long on that because I guess you've been overwhelmed with many data on the issues which is related to energy needs, of course, the growing population, the growing share of middle class, which are higher energy intensive people than poor people, of course. That drives a very strong increase of worldwide energy demand. So it's going to be very difficult to imagine a world with lower energy demand. That's the first fact. The second one is rather ironic, but that still people should just not forget that the oil era is a very, very, very tiny part of the world history, and so it's due to stop someday. Some people say peak oil has not come, is not going to come, it's longer than what we think, but anyway, within the next century, we'll have to shift from oil to something else. There's no other way. The question is, of course, the battle is it going to be in 5 years or in 50 years? If it's in 50 years, probably we're a little early with hydrogen. If it's in 5 years, we're at the right spot. So that means that we need to find many alternative fuel and energy solutions, and that's one of the drivers for the development of hydrogen. Fact 3, well, I take the assumption that everybody agrees that we have an increase of greenhouse gases emission, which is going to increase the temperature, with the need to try to stop that. We basically do not and would not push renewable energy if we were not convinced of that. For us, I mean for Air Liquide, there's no issue related to that. So there is a need to reduce CO2 emission. There is a need to reduce CH4 emissions also, because they have a ratio which is extremely strong in terms of contribution to greenhouse gases emissions. We are speaking about hydrogen only because there is that. If you don't have issues of scarcity of resources and CO2 emission reduction, then you don't need to speak about hydrogen. Let's do something else. Let's have a speech about I don't know what. But so the key is that you need to solve that issue. And when you want to look at the way you solve that issue of greenhouse gases emission, and you look at, for example, the European vision, which is to try to reduce emission by 80% by 2050, most of the sectors are going to be impacted. The key sectors are, of course, residential buildings, but also industry and energy, and transport. And if you want to reach 80% abatement, one of the key place where you need to do that is transportation, because you need to reduce it by basically 95%. So that's a critical element where we need to do something. A couple of figures on Europe, just to give you an illustration of the key figures at stake. Basically, because that plays a role in the whole picture on hydrogen. First, 430 billion euros of oil imported every year. That's a huge impact on the global commercial balance. Second, around 4.6 billion tons of CO2 equivalent emissions, which is 15% of the total world emissions. And you've got a split of it over there. You see transport close to 1 billion, energy of course 1.5, even though in energy we have a couple of countries which are low emitting countries, like France. A total GDP, I guess you might know it, but I just remind you, it's around 12,000 billion euro per year. And that gives an idea of what are the big figures we are playing around. Now, if you look at how to abate emissions, there are many things that you can do. I'm not going to ask you to read all the lines because, of course, it's a little small. But basically, you can work on efficiency in the industry and gasification of waste. You can work a lot on buildings. And building is a big contributor of emissions. You see, this is we've looked here. We've listed 20 technologies which are ready or close to ready that could be applied in the next 15 years in Europe and could help reduce the emission of CO2. That's a mapping which we've done with another company called Shift, Carbon 4. And when we listed all the things that we could do, we found out that in total, if we were only applying technology solutions, we would only reduce the emissions by 30%. So only by applying very significant development, and we would still spend a lot of money. I think it's 1.6 thousand million euros, which is a lot. And that would not solve the whole problem. So technology will not do everything. And then the issue is which solutions do you compare? If you want to fight energy transition, what is the metric you take? Because that's one of the most controversial debates we have within the industry and within the different groups which are pushing their own solutions. Many people say we should look at the euro invested per ton of CO2 you're going to suppress. But is it really the right metric? Because there is also the cost of your technology, which is going to be, of course, often more, which is going often to be higher than the cost of incumbent energy solutions. Today, it's more expensive to have a battery electric car than a classical car. It's more expensive to do wind offshore or to do solar than to do a classical combined cycle. So there is a delta cost. That delta cost pays for avoiding some CO2 emission. What's the best? It depends also what is the scenarios you take on the evolution of the oil prices. What is the actualization rate you take for your capex? Do you amortize them 20 years, 10 years, 15 years? Do you take 10% or 6% return? All that is very, very moving. So it's not so easy. Second, so it's really a political decision. It's also, do you want to create investments which are going to create jobs? Or do you want really to abate CO2? A lot of the investments which are considered in the energy transition law in France will also push for residential buildings change. That creates a lot of jobs. So that's very good for job creation. That's not always the most efficient in terms of cost of CO2 abated, but it's creating many jobs. So you need also to take into account those parameters. But at the end, there are going to be also many non-technical mitigation solutions, development of public transportation, different behavioral change of our behavior in the way we eat, in the way we travel. All that is beyond, in a way, an industry control, but that's part of what is going to change. So this was just to give you the background. So there is a need for an energy transition. We believe that. There's going to be some behavioral changes, some society changes, but there are also some technical issues. So the belief we have is that hydrogen in that energy transition picture could be a key carrier of the energy transition, we believe, for two reasons. First, because it has a role to play in the energy, in the renewable energy offtake in the whole system as a storage vehicle. And second, it's a very good solution for clean transportation if it is coupled with fuel cell. So hydrogen is not something new. Probably, well, you all know about hydrogen, of course, but you probably less know for some of you that is already a molecule which we use regularly in many forms and in many industries. It's distributed in gaseous form, in liquid form, it's batch, it's continuous, it's huge volumes or very small volumes, it's very high purity or it's classical level purity. The major use of hydrogen, of course, is already for environmental purpose because it's used to desulfurize or hydrocrack oil so that it complies with the regulations for light oil on low sulfur oil. And it's been developed by us because hydrogen used to be the key molecule circulating within refineries, but because of the change of the regulation on the one side, on the change of the oil composition that you extract from the key exporting countries, the balance of hydrogen is negative. So you need to import hydrogen into the refineries to get in line with the regulations. So that's why we've become, Air Liquide and other players, very strong in supplying hydrogen to those refineries. You need to know also that hydrogen started with the space industry. The first real hydrogen energy, which is hydrogen as a propellant application, is Ariane, is the launcher Ariane. We've invented and we created everything from that major application, which is still a success, even though SpaceX is challenging it. We are supplying the hydrogen in liquid fuel for Ariane. And of course, we believe, starting 2015, that you will see, and you have already some cars in the road which are going to use hydrogen combined with fuel cell. In order to do that, we also master many applications. It's not new to do hydrogen. The technologies are very mature. It's not something that has been invented 10 years ago. It's also distributed in a safe way in many forms, in pipelines, in trucks, in tube trailers, in cylinders. And the applications are very numerous. So hydrogen is nothing new. Another way to show it is that if you look at the map only of the plants, the unit we have to produce hydrogen in the world, we have more than 200 units producing hydrogen. We are making already more than 2 billion euro sales producing hydrogen. So I'm not trying to promote Air Liquide here. I'm just trying to explain that hydrogen is a very known, popular, well-used molecule in the industrial world, less in the individual or civil residential world, but the industrial world is extremely widely used. And you can see also that in certain areas, like in the Benelux, we have even dedicated pipelines, which are interconnecting units so that we have a better supply, reliability, and efficiency to our customers. So what we're entering when we speak about energy transition is that hydrogen can be used as an energy vector. So I'm not going to explain the technicalities of how do you do electricity with hydrogen, but basically the idea is that if you combine hydrogen with air into a fuel cell, basically the hydrogen is going through a membrane which separates the proton and the electron. The electron fuels an electric current. And on the other side of the membrane, basically oxygen is coming, the oxygen from the air is coming, and is recombining with the proton of hydrogen, and that makes water. So it's basically the reverse of what you might have done when you were very young in the lycée, when you were doing electrolysis, and you were discovering the properties of hydrogen and oxygen by doing electrolysis, where water is transformed into electricity, into hydrogen and oxygen. That's basically exactly the reverse, and we're going to speak about it because we use electrolysis on the one side and fuel cell on the other side. So, we believe, because you can use hydrogen to generate electricity, we believe there is a way to store very well energy. it happens that hydrogen, as you say, can be used in chemical application. It can be blended with natural gas. It can be recombined with air to do electricity. Hydrogen, as you know, is a very high density energy molecule. So it's easily feasible to generate a lot of energy with a small amount of hydrogen. So when people try to define how can you store energy today, because that's one of the big issues with renewable energy, then you can see it's not very clear, but when you move into a high level of energy, which means long duration storage solutions, you very rapidly come to situations where only hydrogen is available. And when you want to go to high level of power, it's the same. You very fast need to move into hydrogen because it's the most convenient way to store energy. The most convenient and the cheapest way is to use pumped hydroelectricity, of course. The problem we have is that in Europe, especially, many of the hydroelectricity basins are already saturated, so it's difficult to invest in many more hydroelectricity system where you pump water when you've got free electricity and you reuse it when you need it. That's of course the best one, the best option, but it's saturated in many countries. So there are also many batteries solutions, but they're more reliable for a small amount of energy on low power because they're very expensive and they're very heavy. And they're not so versatile in terms of use when you want to discharge them. So what can we do when you know that you can store hydrogen? The idea that many people promote and that we do also promote, even though we need to be careful with what can be seriously done. Some things can be seriously done, otherwise are more difficult to justify economically. That's what I want to cover with you. Basically, the idea is that long term, you will have, of course, a lot of energy available from intermittent sources, which raise the question of storing them when you don't need them. One of the ways to store them, not the only one, but one of the ways is to do hydrogen using electrolysis with an efficiency which is average, 60%. It's not the best, but that's not so bad, and that's extremely efficient in capacity to take energy as it comes. It's very flexible. And then that hydrogen, you can then use it for several applications. Cogeneration for residential buildings. In Japan, you've got 100,000 homes which are fueled by CHP type of solutions, which are based on fuel cell technology, using natural gas, transforming it into hydrogen and then delivering electricity on it, on hot water. Of course, cars, I'm going to go to that later, on other applications where you basically fuel remote sites which are not connected to the grid, where you don't have any other solutions. The other way, of course, is to do hydrogen using the classical way, which is reforming, so you crack natural gas. That is the most widely used technology today. 95% of the volumes are using that way. But long term, if we want the thing to be really useful for the energy system, you will have part of the hydrogen done using electrolyzer. What do you do with the hydrogen really after that? The issue you have, I'm going to pass this one, is that when you've got your hydrogen, you can either say that molecule has a value, as an energetic value, as a fuel, or it can be blended with natural gas, so you could store it into natural gas pipelines. You've got a couple of experience being done on the subject. You can basically blend it in existing pipelines with natural gas with up to around 10% volume, not more, because then you've got some embrittlement issues. You can also decide to use it and re-power it and then generate electricity. Some people push that. We have our doubts because we'll have 2 times the inefficiency on the hydrogen generation and then on the power generation on the other side. So the global efficiency is not so fantastic, and the capex are significant. And then, of course, you can use it for its, I would say, it's a value for mobility as a substitution for oil. And the beauty of that one is that, of course, it allows you to transfer intermittent energy into transport. And you don't have so many ways to do so. You've got batteries, of course, also, but with the issues of batteries that we're going to go further later. The problem you have is that to do hydrogen from intermittent sources, the only way is to do electrolysis. And electrolysis basically is water which is transformed into hydrogen and oxygen, and you need electricity. And the problem with electrolysis is that the capex of electrolysis, the cost of the equipment, is expensive. So to amortize your capex, the best you need to make the unit run all year, so 8,000 hours. But the problem is that it's interesting to use intermittent energy when the energy is cheap. And when the energy is cheap, it's not 8,000 years. It's probably 2,000 years. So you need to make an arbitration between the price of electricity and the capex cost. And in average, what we consider is that you will need to basically run your electrolyzer around 50% of the time. Some of the power will be the baseload power, and some of the power will be the peak load power. That's one of the issues you have with electrolyzer, and that's one of the reasons why that model, which is to use intermittent energy in the future to capture what is available and to solve the intermittent energy solution, will require a strong technology roadmap to decrease the cost of electrolysis so that your hydrogen comes at a sustainable cost for the future. But that's basically the way it could be used in the future. Then we looked at what would be the impact of using that hydrogen in the two solutions which are not using it for transportation but for mixing with natural gas, or repowering and redoing electricity when you need it. And you come to very significant different prices. This is the gas price. This is the price of using landfill gases. And then if you use hydrogen from electrolysis and you take the fuel value of hydrogen, the energy content of hydrogen, you see it's a lot more expensive, of course, than natural gas. But that's normal because that molecule is not used to be mixed with natural gas. So it's feasible to use hydrogen and to put it into natural gas pipelines, but it's difficult to justify economically. So we don't think that's the major avenue today. It might be tomorrow if the natural gas price increases, but it's going to be a challenge. Same on the power side. If you take your hydrogen, if you take the assumption you have hydrogen, so you have paid your electrolysis, your running costs, and then you reuse your electrolysis, then you put your hydrogen into a fuel cell to redo power, then you pay the capex for electrolysis, the capex for the fuel cell, the opex of those two, and that gives you a price. And you see that hydrogen is, of course, more expensive than using a classical pumped hydro system. So hydrogen is a molecule which we can do many things with, but you need to find the right business model to make it competitive long term. And so we believe, and we're going to look at that now, that the beauty of hydrogen is to couple it with transportation, with mobility, with industry applications. So basically, on the one side, because of its very strong energy density, the ability to take renewable energy and to store it, hydrogen is part of the equation we will need long-term to store energy. Now what we believe is that if you go now on the other side of the equation, which is transport, decarbonation, we believe that one of the potential use of hydrogen and one of the key roles it's going to play is to help decarbonize the transportation. And this is what we're going to look now. So I remind you that today, I'm moving now to transport. Today, a classical car has a theoretical efficiency which is around 25% in kilowatt hour in, kilowatt hour out. Environmental performance, which of course are improving regularly but are still weak with a lot of emissions. and with, of course, CO2 emissions linked to the fuel content on the input. And so many people say tomorrow, of course, oil will not disappear. I'm not saying that at all. Oil will remain a very key element of the propulsion and transportation industry in the future, but it will shift progressively to new technologies which are driven by stronger electrification. So there will be batteries, and we believe fuel cell will play its role, and we will explain, we'll see why now. First, so what is it? Basically, the logic of a fuel cell car is that you basically take the air inlet from around the car. It's going through a fuel cell. It's then generating electricity, and then it's supplying an electric motor. It's an electric car, except that the energy, instead of being stored in a battery, is stored in a reservoir, high pressure. And then it's fueling the fuel cell, which converts it into electricity. The big difference with, and of course the result is only water, because the reaction generates only water. The big difference is the following, is that on the CO2 emission, if you compare it to a classical car, those figures are not Air Liquide figures, they are basically shared by the profession. It's rather classical scientific results. On the oil side, you basically, on a well-to-well approach, the energy you take to extract the oil or to extract the energy up to the wheel of the car, okay? So the full chain. You basically have a stronger emission on the hydrogen side because you need to crack the natural gas today. Today, you're mostly doing it with natural gas, so you have emissions on the production of hydrogen and then the transportation of hydrogen to your station where you're going to fuel the car. But then, in the car, you've got zero emissions, absolutely zero emissions. On the oil side, you've got a total of around 180 grams per kilometers. That's the average park numbers. Because of the efficiency of your oil, which is then going through the combustion engine with CO2 emissions. Tomorrow, a couple of things are going to happen. The hybrid motorization will reduce the emission because in cities you will use electricity, and you will have better efficiency, lighter vehicles, etc. But on the other side, if you do green hydrogen, which means you use renewable energy to do hydrogen using electrolysis, or if you do hydrogen with biogas and not from natural gas, then you get to a full zero emission picture. And of course, the other element is that you do absolutely no particles, which is the real issue in cities. It's not CO2, it's the particles. Now, if you compare with electrical vehicle, because electrical vehicle is also is not a zero emission, because everybody knows now that the full cycle of battery electric emits some CO2 when you manufacture the batteries, but it's a clean vehicle, I would say, because no particle emission. The first element that you have, which is different, is that the battery electric vehicle has an autonomy which is in average 200 kilometers. Alors you might go a little better than that with the Teslas. They claim 300. If you really drive the Tesla the way normally you would like to drive a Tesla, I can tell you it's not 300. Huh? If you drive it as a Twingo, of course it's 300, but I'm not sure you're buying a Tesla to drive it as a Twingo. Then you have the fuel cell car. This is the one that Toyota is just putting on the market next year. They're claiming 700 kilometers. Let's be clear, that's using the standard calculation they use in Japan. It more corresponds, I would say, to 500, 600 kilometers. It's a little less than 700. But it's clearly very comparable to a classical car. So that's the first benefit. The second one, of course, is that you know perfectly that the issue with batteries is that you need to recharge them. So except when you have found a very nice business model, which is exceptional, like Autolib, where you're using the time where the car is parked to effectively refuel it with the battery system, except when you do that in urban mobility, then you basically need many hours. And it's to compare with the refueling system for hydrogen, which is a gas, high pressure. It takes 3 to 5 minutes. The issue we have is that we don't have the stations today, but we'll come to that in a minute. But basically, it's the benefits of the electricity in terms of emissions and comfort of use, and the benefits of fuel in terms of recharging time and autonomy. That's the vision we have. The reason for that, for those of you who don't know, is well summarized there. Of course, the best energy we have ever found, and that will probably ever be, is oil. In terms of density, volumetric or gravimetric density, oil, of course, is very good. You see, to store the energy necessary for 300 miles with diesel, this is what you need in kilos. The fuel on the system is very simple, and in terms of volume, this is the number of liters. So fuel cell, you're storing 6 kilos of hydrogen, but as it is high pressure, you have pressurized it a lot, you need to have a very strong reservoir to make sure you have no risk. And that's, even though if it's composite, so it's lighter, it's still of course rather heavy, but it's still a lot less heavy, a lot lighter than a battery system. It's only the pure energy densities of the molecule. Lithium-ion, you're 350, 360 watt-hour per kilo. Hydrogen, before compression and before storage, is 33 kilowatt-hour. So then you need to compress it a lot because it's very light. So at the end of the day, you come to more around 5 times better than the lithium batteries. So it's less than oil, but it's a lot better than batteries. And that's the same for the volume. There is a multiplication by 3 in terms of the volume you need to go from hydrogen to battery. That's why you have a better situation with hydrogen than with the battery for autonomy on recharging time. That's a summary of the situation, of what we have today and what we're going to have tomorrow. Today, the average park in gas or diesel is basically emitting well-to-wheel around 180. Everybody believes that with the start and stop, with lighter vehicles, with increased performance on the engines and so on, we are going to be able to reach around 95. But it will be very difficult to go better than that. And it will be also possible to do very huge autonomies. I don't know if we need that autonomy, but we will be capable to reach very huge autonomy. The batteries, today, with the current European mix of energy, because it's dependent on your mix of energy, is basically emitting around 60 grams of CO2 per kilometer. If you make it completely green, it might go to 0. That does not take into account the life cycle of producing the battery. If you add the battery production CO2 emission, it's probably a little worse than that. The hybrid, of course, is a very solid transition technology, but it's very dependent on how you run your car. If you go outside of the city, you will fast use your fuel, so you will fast go to high levels. Hydrogen is in the middle. Today, as it is mostly done using natural gas, the emissions levels are there, but if you go green, the emissions level go to 0. So that's basic. There's no trick. It's rather logic. And I guess in this school, people understand very well rather logic. So another way to look at the efficiency of the hydrogen cycle is to say that if you take your energy, the full picture, your energy from wind power, tomorrow you want to be completely clean. So you take wind power, you have your electrolysis, which gives you an efficiency of 70%. So you have some losses. Then you transport your hydrogen, you compress it, you transport it to the station, you lose another part of energy. Then you put it in your fuel cell vehicle. The fuel cell technology has an efficiency of 50%. The rest is lost in a heat. So that makes a total loss of around, the total efficiency of around 30%. It's a little less than a pure electric vehicle, of course, but since you have a better autonomy, you are still globally better than using a classical engine. Above all, if you have started with wind power, you have a full renewable chain. So, I don't know if I have convinced you, but I'm going to come to what are the challenges now, because that just shows that technically it's feasible to replace part of your infrastructure of transport with hydrogen-based solutions. That was, I would say, not the theories, because everything is basically can be demonstrated by using a couple of equations on the analysis, but then what's the reality, what's the state of the art today? So here it's a very rough resume of something that we do within Air Liquide. We have a small company called Axan, which is doing stationary fuel cell. Stationary fuel cells are not pretending to fuel cars tomorrow. It's just to show the progress the technology has done just for us, our out level. We are not pretending to have the same level of involvement and expertise in developing a fuel cell motor as a Toyota or Daimler or other companies like that. But just us, we've managed to increase the power density in 10 years from 0.25 watt per square centimeter to 0.70. We've managed to reach a lifetime without changing the membranes of the fuel cell, which is the critical part where you got the platinum content and the efficiency of the conversion, from a couple of 100 hours to 12,000. We've managed to decrease the consumption of hydrogen per kilowatt hour by around 30%. We've managed to start the fuel cell at we were capable only to start it when it was basically not summertime, but almost. So in the winter, you could not do anything. So now we can start it even in Canada, I would say, in the winter. So we've seen the performance. And the availability of the system itself has moved significantly. So if we can do that as Air Liquide in a relatively small company, which is not having the same ambition as a car company, you can imagine what it brings for car companies. And that's an example of what has been achieved in the car industry. They had a lot of issues. They have issues on the management of heat, on the water management, make sure that it's not freezing when it's too cold. Issues on the sizing and the volume of all the systems so that it's feasible to embark that in a car. The first cars that had been put in place in the early 2000s by Daimler or others, the fuel cell and the reservoir were taking basically all the trunk, all the back of the car. So it was only a car for two people. Today, Daimler is designing its new series. Basically, the fuel cell system is taking exactly the same space of the classical engine. And the reservoir are basically not changing at all the space you have in your car. So the weight, the performance, the cost, the platinum content, the capacity to start and stop at a very large spectrum of temperature, all that has been solved in the last 10 years. Regularly, people say there is a lot of buzz on hydrogen and so on, but what's happening? Technologically, the cars you see now, the car I have here in the parking lot, has nothing to compare with what people were speaking about 15 years ago. These are real cars, real efficiency, real comfort in drive. It's also true that some markets have started. You've got already 5,000 stationary systems operating everywhere in the world for backup solutions, for telecom tower refueling. You've got 3,000 forklifts. A forklift in a logistic platform is consuming a lot more oil or energy than a car because it's working every day. So forklift is a fantastic application for hydrogen or for us because it's very good. It's mobility, it's simple mobility. It's returning to the base all the time, and it's a high-consuming industry. And so today you've got the Walmart, the Coca-Cola, the Procter & Gamble, the Cisco's of the world, which have converted a couple of their logistic platforms to change their forklifts, which were in batteries, into forklifts using hydrogen because they save some time in recharge, they save some space because there is no recharging room anymore, you don't need. And then the productivity of the system is a lot better. And then you've got already many refueling stations which are used for demonstration purposes on already 300 demonstration vehicles. So I showed you one movie. I would like to show you another one. I don't know which. I think this one is.
A human being can survive 3 days without water. Here, it's only 14 hours.
Go team. Your last moments in civilization, how you feeling? Today, we are going to travel through the wilds of Death Valley, surviving only on the water produced by our car.
The F-Cell engine runs on compressed hydrogen. Its only emission, water vapor. We attached a tank to the car to collect its emissions.
This is all our water for the next 2 days. Okay, last water.
The ultimate test for Diane and Joshua, and for the future of emission-free mobility.
Explore the Death Valley.
It is hot.
3 hours after they started, the moment of truth. Is it really possible to drink a car's emissions?
Heads it is. These were the last moments of Diane Kruger.
It looks like water.
Give it a sniff. Here goes. Survey says.
Tastes totally fine.
Really?
Yep. We're saved!
That's wild. That's crazy. Our car makes water. Drive around, make some water?
Take a shower?
That's sort of anticlimactic. I was expecting drama or death on the sideway. I don't know.
Wait for me! That has absolutely no taste.
After 2 days and 21 liters of emissions consumed, the most unusual car test came to a happy end.
To surviving Death Valley.
I'm not sure that you're going to be able to get like power windows, leather seats, and a water pump, but the technology is there.
Yes.
So there is another one, but maybe I show it at the end. So what's happening now? So you have a ability to store intermittent energy on the one side, and a capacity to do hydrogen at a competitive cost. I didn't tell it, by the way. Today the vision is that hydrogen at the pump will be delivered at around 10 euros per kilo. On 1 kilo of hydrogen allows you to do around 100 kilometers. So if you make the calculation, you compare that with the typical cars which are going to start using hydrogen, they replace SUVs or large cars. You will have to replace something doing around 8 liters on 100 kilometers. So if you take out the tax, you're rather competitive. So you're going to tell me, but why don't you pay tax on hydrogen? Yes, of course, but hydrogen is not polluting. On the day I'm going to have to pay tax, it means that I'm already in a big market, and that's very good. So today, hydrogen without tax is competitive with diesel solutions. Basically, that is the list of the companies which have started developing series and have started to sell cars on the market. The first one is Hyundai. And so the car that I've come with is a Hyundai car. There are two French cars, two cars in France which are fuel cell cars, which we bought Air Liquide to show the way. You've got Toyota, which has announced that they would start in 2015 selling the cars in California and Japan. You've got, by the way, Japan, which has a complete hydrogen society concept, which is even stronger than what I showed you, because they really want to transform everything. Then you've got Honda, which is going to follow in 2015. This is they've not yet displayed their real new model. That's a concept car still, but it's going to be on the market by 2015. And Daimler is going to get out with the car in 2017. Today they have the fuel cell car, which is a B class, but they're going probably to go into the C class series with their future car on the market. Nissan will follow because they share the same platform with Daimler, and Ford as well. BMW has an alliance with Toyota, so they will probably follow a little bit Toyota and get out with some cars in between 2018 and 2020. So all the key players are moving. I know, except a couple of ones we speak about it if you want after on the questions. So many stations are already deployed, running, or intended. They're all, of course, not refueling so many cars because it's really the start. It's the problem of the chicken and egg. And we come to that in a minute. You can see that France is rather unique. I don't want to start the dispute with some of the people who are not believing in hydrogen, but of course France is probably not the best country to start so far, even though it should be, but well, we will discuss that after if you want. Germany is strongly motivated, first because Daimler and the others, they are providers of very large cars. And if you want to match long-term the regulations which are coming on stream in Europe, in the US, or everywhere, you have no other choice. A battery car will not make it. You have no other choice than to move fuel cell, or you need to move biofuel, but biofuel, you will not have ever enough biofuel to fuel the car industry. It will be used for airplanes, probably not for the car industry. And so they have started also because since they've decided to move out of the nuclear energy, they've started a lot of the famous Energiewende with a lot of renewable, with some issues on the capex they've put on the table. But at the end of the day, they're basically building an infrastructure which is a complete energy shift, which is costing today but might save them tomorrow. It's more they're more kind of they have an infrastructure view and not a flow view, I think, which is very different. And so they need stations to start fueling the cars which are going to go on the market, and they push it because they see it as a way to store their intermittent energy long term. A couple of other countries have developed initiatives to try to deploy the technology. Japan, of course, because all the key players in Japan car industry are ready and have their fuel cell technology. And the government wants also to find an alternative to nuclear because of the Fukushima events. And so they need to find something, and hydrogen is one of the solutions they've found, even though it's they're not solving the energy generation, because hydrogen, you need energy to get it. Europe as supports Europe, the European Commission and the European Union supports the technology. There are a couple of directives which have been put in place showing the way to deploy alternative infrastructure for alternative fuels, LNG, batteries, and hydrogen. There is a joint undertaking which is also financing the sector with an increased budget, a little more than 1 billion. The Scandinavian countries, and especially Denmark, have very strong incentives to promote zero-emission vehicle. And in France, I'll come back in a minute to that, we are developing a couple of more captive fleet focused deployment strategies to start the market of some cars. In California, they have developed a very specific mandate to clean progressively the car park. The regulation plays a key role in all that, which is the zero-emission vehicle, the ZEV mandate, which basically imposes on each car players to put on the market every year a certain number of zero-emission cars. They don't want them to reduce their classical car emissions, they want them to replace progressively by zero emissions. The result of that is that many companies are pushing the introduction in the market of fuel cell cars there because it's the only way for them to match the ZEV mandate. That's also thanks to that regulation that Tesla, for example, has started in California because they managed to monetize part of their credits to car companies which do not have electric cars, which allow them to price the Tesla at an affordable for people who are rich, an affordable price to the market. So in Germany, there is a private consortium which has been established with, as you can see, a couple of key names, including Daimler, but also Total and Shell, which tries to say we're going to make a real de-risking of the technology by engaging into a deployment strategy where we will invest up to 400 stations, so that it's possible for an individual person to effectively buy those cars and circulate throughout Germany with no problems. This is what we do ourselves, Air Liquide. We are part of the system, we are part of all those consortium, and we are all also starting to invest ourselves stations to demonstrate the technology, to get it reliable, to show that it is safe, and to learn and to standardize, so that when we move into the mass deployment, we're capable to produce and manufacture series, large series of stations. The names that you see have absolutely no interest, sorry. These are the nicknames of the program, which are usually funded, co-funded by us and the European Commission or Germany or whatsoever, kind of a national program supporting this shift. So, of course, all that is very nice, but you've got a couple of key issues. The first one is that you need to find a way to get to the consumer a car which is competitive in terms of price and in terms of everything except price, which means comfort of use, reliability, availability of recharging points, and all that is not granted when you start. Second, we need to solve the chicken and egg dilemma. As you can see, if you don't have stations, you cannot fuel your cars. I'm not going to put stations if there is no cars, so we need to find a way forward. This is what we are doing with the consortium approach in Germany. This is what Japan is doing with the NEDO, saying I'm going to finance myself the deployment of 100 stations. This is what California is doing with dedicated grant programs to make sure that stations are coming along with the market entry of fuel cell cars. We have a big issue, which is that we are entering really what many people speak about the Valley of Death, but I can tell you the Valley of Death on that technology is significant. This is I think the first time in the history of industry development that you basically substituting with a new infrastructure an existing one which is very efficient, because the oil delivery system is extremely efficient. Some people try to compare with mobile telecom industry, but that has nothing to do, because when the mobile came, it was not replacing the fixed. It was adding a lot of new users and a lot of new benefits that people were ready to pay for. Here, we are exactly in the case where we need to substitute something existing on cheap by something which is not as cheap today, and which is uncertain. So we are completely in the Valley of Death problematic, where if you don't find supporting schemes, regulations, financial instruments, on a real dedication from all actors, then the shift is not going to take place. And that is valuable for all the energy transition issues. We had the feed-in tariffs for windmills and solar, but the more you grow, the more difficult it is to swallow that through feed-in tariffs. So this is the very question of energy transition. And linked to that, the first mover disadvantage. Why should I start bringing stations, network? I'm going to lose money during 10 years, probably, if I have no support. And when the network is there, my dear friend from an oil and gas industry will build the next station, will benefit from all the ramp-up, and have lost nothing. So nobody has a genuine interest today to start. So why do we start? Well, we start because we believe that we need to make the move to the change. If we continue and everybody is waiting with a short-term vision, then we will never do the energy transition. But for that, we need support from the public funding authorities. So what we're trying to do to make the thing move forward, we're trying to get strong regulatory supports. We're trying to get financial instruments. We're trying to develop, through public procurement, global procurement of fleets from public operators, which allow us to very rapidly ramp up stations. and we try to make sure that we have a convergent and coordinated approach in the deployment with the car OEMs. So that's a very new and different approach to business by cooperation, which I think has a significant value and is very different from the business as usual. But if it works, it's really going to help move from one system to another. Now I'm going to finish with two very rough ideas of what we could see in the future. I call that imagine. Imagine in the future that things happen. So let's first take the case of Germany. Germany in 2020, we believe that there's going to be need to store around 28 terawatt-hour of energy, which is around 5% of Germany electricity consumption. If you say it's not going to happen like that, if you just take the rough numbers, if you're capable to store that in the form of hydrogen, you're basically generating 500,000 tons of hydrogen. That is enough to fuel yearly 4 million vehicles. That is enough to avoid around 3 billion per year of oil imports. And for that, you will need basically to have, if you want to fuel 4 million vehicles, you will need to have around 4,000 stations. 4,000 stations is going to cost you 4 billion once and for all. But you will save every year, 3 billion euros of imports. So there are a couple of equations like that shows that even though it seems difficult to start, if you take the broader picture, long term, the side benefits of moving from the current situation to renewable and sustainable energy transition situation will generate significant savings. Another way to show it is what has been done by a gathering of several organisms under the umbrella of the European Climate Foundation. They've, on the left side, you've got the oil imports in Europe in 2012, and then you've got 3 scenarios which have been looked at of a progressive shift from the current transport technologies, which is basically oil, into a mix of electricity, fuel cell, hybrid, or low or more efficient combustion engine technology. So you've got the Tech 1, which is not very aggressive, Tech 2, which is giving in 2030, you've got a strong part of electric, plug-in, some hybrid plug-in, battery and hydrogen. On 2050, this is the mix. And then you've got another one which is very aggressive, where you've basically managed to shift completely. It's again, everybody's trying to find matrix to understand what's going to happen. What's interesting is that the transportation mix is going to have an impact on many things, not only on your CO2 emissions. The first element here is the evolution based on the different scenarios of your emissions, what you're going to emit if you don't change, what you're going to emit in the scenario 1, 2, and 3, and what you're going to save. Well, that's of course the original need, but that's difficult to monetize. So what you need to see is the impact on growth, your commercial balance, on your job creation. The value you're getting out from oil industry is a lot of imported value. And of course, the intensity of employment per million euro of added value in the oil industry is not the same at all as the one you have in the manufacturing industry. And so you're basically reducing some value in industries which are creating not so many jobs in Europe to deliver such value, to be replaced by manufacturing jobs, because you're going to manufacture new cars, electric cars, which are completely different and are mostly done in Europe. So the impact from this to this long term is generating, according to this study, a lot of potential new jobs in Europe. Of course, we can debate lengthy about that, but the energy transition is not only about CO2. There are many other things which are at stake, and I believe that those kind of studies are more and more needed to show the way to the next generation of transport and energy. At the end of the day, we believe we need to move because we are all worth it. And so I hope that you will have a lot of questions now. Thank you.